We live in an incredibly complex, highly interconnected world. I want to talk today about what we can do as individuals to help transform the future of that world. And especially, I want to introduce you to some fresh insights that have emerged during the past few decades from a relatively new science called complexity science. And these insights offer us additional tools that could help us in our efforts to maintain and develop the humanistic values of caring, compassion, sharing, and trust in our society. Venerable Ju Wei described to me the beautiful metaphor of Indra's net that exemplifies the interconnectedness of the universe. It's an infinitely large net of cords with a multifaceted jewel at each junction, so that each jewel reflects all of the other jewels. Now, complexity scientists also use an image of a net in their efforts to understand how our interconnected world works, and they ask two deceptively simple questions. How do networks evolve and change as a result of the interactions between their members? And what can we do as individuals to influence the outcome? Now, the answer to that first question is that it is literally impossible to predict the future of our social, economic, and ecological networks because cause and effect become so entangled that they're impossible to disentangle. But the answer to the second question is that nevertheless, there's still quite a lot that we can do as individuals to influence our future if we go about it in an insightful way. Now, let me give you an example of the complexity. The deforestation of the Brazilian rainforest, we're all worried about, has obvious potential effects on climate change and on biodiversity, but it goes further than that. The deforestation provides land for soybean production, and most of that production goes to China. If the trade stopped, China would go elsewhere, and elsewhere in this case means sub-Saharan Africa. And this is where things start to get complex. Land clearance for more agriculture at the end of the Sahara produces dust, and this gets blown all the way back to Brazil and the Caribbean. In Brazil, it actually improves forest productivity, but in the Caribbean, it contributes to the decline in coral reefs. This now affects China and Brazil in a different way, because both of them have invested heavily in Caribbean tourism. Now, the world is full of such examples which defy traditional logic. The intertwined effects are simply too difficult to untangle, and it can be impossible to predict how small change in one part of the system can affect other distant parts. And this means that the top-down planning on control that most political systems at the moment use, on which they are based, just can't work. We need to find other tools to influence our future, ones that we can use as individuals and as small groups of individuals, ones that are based on the reality of complex interconnected networks, rather than the hopeful and outdated dogma of politicians. And modern network science offers two such tools. One involves interacting with people who think very differently from ourselves. The other involves support and love for those who do share our beliefs. Now, I'm not saying that science has all of the answers. That would be ridiculous overclaim. What I am saying is that modern complexity science offers some fresh ways of thinking that are well worth considering as additions to our armory. Now, the image of the world that complexity scientists have used to reach these insights is a bit like Indra's net, where the junctions represent the members of your network. They might represent you, your neighbor, your car, your house, even the ready meal in your freezer. They could represent trees and mountains, the atmosphere and the oceans. In fact, they could represent every functional member of the network that we're considering, whether it's a small family network or our whole complex socio-economic ecological world. Now, the big difference from Indra's net lies in the way that we picture interactions between the individual members. Instead of visualizing reflections, we let the cords do the work. These cords, these links between the different junctions, represent our connections with other members of our network. But they're not just passive connections. The trick with modern network science has been to understand that these connections are active and changeable. So, for example, we can cut them, which is just what we try to do to limit the spread of COVID by isolating individual cases. We can use them to transmit information or material. We can make them stronger or weaker, sometimes by our own actions, and sometimes through the responses that our actions elicit from those with whom we are connected. Now, when an action elicits a reaction, we call the overall process a feedback loop, and our global networks are full of such loops. They are one of the reasons why it can be impossible to predict the behavior of the network as a whole. But we don't need to understand those details here. All we need to know is that our actions can affect the nature and strength of our interactions, and that feedback loops play a very important part in determining how things can turn out. Now, this doesn't just apply to our immediate neighbours. There can be long-range knock-on effects that travel from junction to junction along chord after chord until they affect something in the distance that you're not directly connected to or even aware of. Now, of course, this sort of thinking is very central to Buddhist thinking in general, and it applies especially to what Stephen Hill calls the power of the gift. Let me offer you an example from my own experience. Long ago, I was attempting to make science accessible by showing how scientists think about everyday problems. In fact, I tried to use physics to work out the best way to dunk a biscuit in a cup of tea. And the story made the newspapers, and I received a letter from a schoolboy called Kao Kwan, a 12-year-old schoolboy at an inner London comprehensive school. He thought that my equation was wrong, and he asked me to send him some biscuits for noticing this. But my gift to him was a letter where I explained the science more fully and an apology that I'd eaten all of the biscuits. Now, 12 years later, I received an email from this same schoolboy saying that my letter had changed his life. By taking seriously what he had asked, it gave him the confidence to go forward with his studies in science. The email was addressed from Oriel College, University of Oxford. Now, I still get a tear in my eye when I think of that story, but there's more, because Kao Kwan is now a doctor in Hong Kong, and he's leading a research team studying the sort of incipient diabetes that I now have. So it's possible that my actions may come back to benefit me through a long, complex, and totally unpredictable circular route. But I'd like to talk a bit more about those chains of consequence and the routes that they take. Because if we just rely on passing things from nearest neighbour to nearest neighbour, then it can take a long time for anything to happen. But a few years ago, an Australian network scientist called Duncan Watts found a way around this. He called it the small world model. You might have heard of it as the basis for this idea of 6 degrees of separation, that there's only 6 steps to anyone else in the world. But it caused a revolution in the way that we think about networks. And what Duncan did was to take our net with its junctions and its chords and just add a few extra chords between distant parts, a few extra links. And those long-range steps, just a few extra long-range steps, dramatically reduce the size of the network. In other words, the number of steps that we have to take to get from one part to another. That meant that we could share information and effects and influences through just a few steps, so long as one of those steps was a long-range one. And I want to suggest to you that this insight provides us with the first of our tools. All we need to do is to think of long range, not in terms of physical distance between neighbours or the number of steps we have to take, but in terms of distance between beliefs. And when you think about it in this way, it means that our best chance for initiating change lies in making an effort to establish long-range links with people who think and act very differently from ourselves. To take our Brazilian example, active support for the indigenous peoples of the rainforest who live such different lives could be essential to the preservation of that environment for all, as many studies have shown. But our activities need not be confined to long-range links. The science of complex networks has shown that when communities reach a certain critical size and critical density, then they are liable and able to act as nuclei to seed and catalyze change in local communities, the space around them, the people around them. In practical terms, this means that mutual support within our immediate group of like-minded friends and colleagues is equally important to establishing these long-range communications. We need both. But our second tool must thus be to confirm and to expand that support and to invite others in, as you've done by inviting me to speak here. Now, these two tools that I've talked about are tools for action. But I would like to introduce you to one more, a tool of understanding. Now, the sorts of networks that make up our world are called complex adaptive networks. They're networks because of all of their interconnections. They're complex because of the multiplicity of those connections. And they are adaptive because they change and adapt in response to internal and external circumstances. Now, the key bit of understanding that I want to introduce you to is that such networks can undergo sudden and dramatic change as a whole, and for very minor reasons, as when a single infected bat in a Chinese market can produce a cascading pandemic, or where the failure of a single financial institution can initiate worldwide financial collapse. Now, in those cases, you can see an initiator, a cause, something that started it. But complex adaptive networks can even undergo radical change for no reason at all. And I really mean no reason at all. So some ecosystems, for example, undergo periodic boom and bust episodes. And ecologists for years were looking for reasons as to why this happened. And then my good friend Bob May, who became president of the Royal Society, came along in the 1970s and showed mathematically that the potential for sudden dramatic change is built into the very structure of such networks. So why am I telling you this? It is because our global social, economic, and ecological networks all have the potential for sudden dramatic change built into their very fabric. We need a tool to deal with this, a tool of recognition. Now, recognition comes in two forms. We may recognize from various signs that change is imminent and act to avoid it or ameliorate its effects. But more deeply, we may also use our recognition to accept that change, including sudden dramatic change, is inevitable, and to design our personal and our group philosophies to suit this inbuilt behavior of nature. Now, my understanding of humanistic Buddhism is that its philosophy is well adapted to align with the philosophy that I've just suggested, and also to align with the practicalities of complex adaptive networks as revealed by current science. Now, these are early days, but an understanding of network functionality from a Buddhist perspective may provide us with the best insurance that we can have for a beneficial future that embraces the humanistic values of caring, compassion, sharing, and trust, rather than a disastrous future based on the dogmas that we now know cannot work. Thank you.